Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Tuesday edition here of Point of View, and this hour we're going to spend some time looking at a couple of issues in the news, of course. We'll be looking at the vaccine and some of the politics being played by the vaccine. We sort of alluded to that yesterday when we pointed out that Pfizer knew back in October that they had a vaccine that was 90% effective. Now we can even ask the question, did Moderna know that theirs was 95% effective and then just waited till after the election to make that announcement? Maybe that would have affected the election. Maybe it would not, but we know the bottom line as we looked at the number of individuals in Big Pharma that have contributed to Joe Biden compared to the number that have contributed to Donald Trump, and of course some of the other things that we mentioned yesterday. Another aspect of that, which we'll get to in just a minute, is what's happening between the president and the governor of New York. So we'll get to that in just a minute. And then we want to get into some of the articles we've posted here, why Democrats lost the House, the whole issue of defund the police and how that affected the election. I might just mention yesterday we did have a piece that I posted that made the case that Joe Biden did better in 4 cities, better than Hillary Clinton did. I wanted to post this piece today that was an attempt to counter that so that you, again, get counterpoints on some of these issues. And so that is on the website for you to read as well, if that's something that you would like to dig into a little more detail, because we are starting to see some statistical anomalies and some are easily explainable. Others, I think, point to the fact that maybe there was some voter irregularities. We won't use the word fraud, since, after all, there's no evidence of fraud, according to at least some people. And we'll get into that in just a minute. Let me just mention, next hour, George Barna will be with us. One of the things we'll talk about is the real civil war in America, the issue of worldviews. And if we have some time, he's also written a very good piece about the millennial mindset. And since we do a millennial roundtable, I wanted to cover that for you. And then Ben Courson will be with us at the last half of the next hour, just talking about being thankful during the holidays. We're getting closer to Thanksgiving, and I like to do those kinds of themes there as well. But again, vaccines, a virus should not be political, but everything is politicized. We got that. Okay. You read the New York Times, and the argument was made that Donald Trump right now is withholding the distribution of the vaccine in New York because he and Andrew Cuomo don't get like each other, which may be true, but it's not the real story. Let's go back to our good friend Gary Bauer, who points out, he says, you may recall that the governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, along with other liberal governors, have repeatedly said they will not authorize the distribution of any vaccine in New York State that was developed under Donald Trump until New York bureaucrats determine it is safe. So on Friday, the president, as he was conducting a major briefing detailing the vaccine distribution plan, said that they will distribute the vaccines appropriate to all states, but he won't give it to New York State until state officials request it and are willing to distribute it. Does that make sense? Yes. Well, and again, maybe there is some bad blood between the two. Of course there is. Maybe this was an attempt at revenge. Maybe, but that's not the story. The story is, as he said, I'll quote the president himself, we can't be delivering it to a state that won't be giving it to people immediately. So the governor will let us know when he's ready. I hope he doesn't handle this as badly as he's handled the nursing home. So, as usual, of course, the president had to get in a shot there, but it's a fair statement because indeed that is the case. But nevertheless, the New York Times decided they would distort the statement and actually suggest that this was all done out of spite. But Gary Bauer goes on to remind us that it would be malpractice to send the initial vaccine doses meant for the elderly and first responders to New York State when they won't use them. And that's exactly what Governor Cuomo has said. And so even Governor Cuomo said that the announcement by Pfizer is both good news and bad news. It's good news because the tests look good. It's bad news because it's about 2 months before Joe Biden takes over, and I don't trust the president. And so all of this back and forth has now led to the governor threatening to sue President Trump to get access to the vaccine he seemingly did not want. So that's the background story. Again, it is easy to blame President Trump because of some of the things he says in his tweets and maybe even some of the back and forth between him and the governor. But I stand by the argument, which I think is very good. If your state, and I don't care which one it is, it could be Michigan, could be California, could be New York, if that governor says, we're not going to distribute it, why send it there? Especially for these reasons. Number one, the Pfizer vaccine requires a special kind of containment. You can't just put it in a normal refrigerator. Moderna, apparently the vaccine can be in a typical refrigerator, not the Pfizer one. So you can think of the amount of cost, time, and equipment necessary to then send a vaccine to a state where it's not going to be used. And then to have it sit there for 2 months, until we're only going to distribute it after Joe Biden takes the oath of office. Who's being petty now? Think that through for just a minute, and I think you got a good answer to that question. Again, if you're interested in this piece that came out just the other day on Pfizer, and again, I don't have any dog in the hunt. If anything, just the opposite. My dad used to work for Pfizer, so yesterday probably was seen as a little critical of Pfizer, but when you go through and recognize that they claimed that they were not part of Operation Warp Speed when they were, claimed that they did not receive any funds, true but misleading, since they did sign an advance purchase agreement for $1.95 billion for 100 million doses of the vaccine. That would be one of those things that's technically true but extremely misleading. And then again, the fact that we do know that in October they were aware of the effectiveness of the vaccine, at a time when even Anthony Fauci was telling us that we may not have a vaccine available until 2021. And then, of course, as I pointed out yesterday, if you go to opensecrets.org, you will see that if you just identify some of the better-known members of Pfizer's executive leadership, you will see that $256,000, in other words, $250,000 by Pfizer executives was given to Joe Biden, and about $62,000 given to Donald Trump. And, of course, also the other comments about the fact that Big Pharma has never been really a fan of Donald Trump ever since he said he was going to work really hard to try to bring down drug costs. Now, you might say, well, isn't that also the plan for Joe Biden? Well, there's the difference. Saying that you're going to fight Big Pharma and actually fighting Big Pharma, two different things. And don't take my word for it. This is one time when I will favorably quote from Michael Moore in his movie Sicko, in which he points out how much money has gone to the Democrats who talk a good plan about going after Big Pharma, but when they get so much money from Big Pharma, you don't really see the same kind of actions that were part of the speeches when they were out there trying to win votes. So just pay attention to it. We'll see what unfolds next year. But if nothing else, just wanted to cover that on the area of the vaccine. Vaccines and viruses should not be politicized, but we live in a world where everything has been politicized. And so we're going to go back and get into a couple of the articles that I have posted for you to read, and then try out a few other ideas that I'm thinking about right now that I might even put in Viewpoints commentaries. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Yesterday, I ended my commentary by saying that you should trust your own judgment. Many of the so-called experts really don't understand your world, even though they have great power in the media and politics to control you. I think it is time to realize that censorship is going to happen, especially on social media platforms like Twitter, and plan accordingly. Last month, the Senate Commerce Committee held hearings on the topic of online speech. Jack Dorsey, who's the CEO of Twitter, appeared on screen with a long beard and long hair looking like he'd been living on the streets in San Francisco. The editors of the Wall Street Journal said he gave the impression that he could not care less about his company's abuse. One minute he denied they were silencing views contrary to his political beliefs. The next minute he seemed to contradict himself by arguing that they need to monitor what is being said in order to earn the trust of people using Twitter. Remember, this is the social media organization that shut down the account of the New York Post for weeks and blocked all links to their story about the business dealings of Hunter Biden. Here's the issue. If Twitter can shut down the account of the fourth largest newspaper in the country, and the oldest newspaper founded by Alexander Hamilton, it can shut down you. Senator Ted Cruz asked, who elected you and put you in charge of what the media are allowed to report and what the American people are allowed to hear? We're just going to have to face the fact that Twitter and other social media platforms are not going to change, especially after the 2020 election results. Congress could change the Communications Decency Act that provided them with immunity from legal action, but there aren't enough members of Congress interested in amending the law. We need to find other ways to communicate because Twitter will continue to censor with virtual impunity. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
You know, as we get closer to Thanksgiving, it is going to be a time in which we're just going to have to put the election in the rearview mirror and occasionally glance back at it. And before that takes place, I thought it would be appropriate to look at two of the articles I've posted here today. One comes from the Wall Street Journal. The other one was posted by Byron York in the Washington Examiner, because it does just, I think, give us some lessons to learn. Because, again, this is not going to be the only time we have an election for the House of Representatives. 2 years from now, we will have had another one. And so it is important to maybe see if there were some lessons learned. And also, it gives us a little bit of a perspective on what's going to happen this year in the House. This will be the smallest House majority margin since 1919. The Republicans, when they were able to take over the House in 1994 with the leadership of Newt Gingrich and the Contract with America, was a very significant sweep. When, again, the Republicans held the House for a while under Paul Ryan, first of all, some of the others, John Boehner, and then Paul Ryan, and then lost it. Nancy Pelosi was able to actually have a pretty sizable majority. This time she will not. And this, I think, illustrates again that some of the things that surfaced in the House of Representative races actually caught many of the pollsters off guard, caught many of the Democrats off guard, and also put, if you will, a wind in the sails of Kevin McCarthy and some of the leadership in the Republican Party, thinking that maybe 2 years from now they will actually be in the majority. So let's talk through some of those issues. First article there, why Democrats nearly lost the House, and it points out that Democrats almost lost the majority of the House in November 3rd. They've already lost 8 seats and could lose as many as 13 after the counting ends. I'm not sure with a couple of those races I've been watching up there in Burgess Owens in Utah. I think they would count that one as a victory. If not, I think that one's going to be. And so anyway, this particular article reminds us that Democrats lost 2 House races in South Florida, at least 2 House races in California, and then here and there all over the United States. These are places that they had gained in 2018 and now, of course, lost them 2 years later. They failed to pick up seats in Texas, Ohio, and Florida, which they were really targeting. If you are in the right now, the listening audience in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, you recognize that there were so many commercials on a couple of these congressional races that it just wore you out. And yet, in most cases, these races which were targeted did not flip. And so that was the case. And they said we also count some 26 races so far that Democrats won with 52% of the vote or less, which is a nice way to say that in a time in which there was record turnout and a lot of those people are going to vote for Joe Biden, because he did win the popular vote, those people will not show up on the polls 2 years from now. I guarantee you they will not, unless you've got some Senate race that's like Beto O'Rourke that kind of manipulates some of the issues. It's certainly going to be one that even suggests a more likelihood of Republicans perhaps taking over control of the House of Representatives. As I pointed out, this, according to the Wall Street Journal, the result is the smallest House majority since 1919, and especially shocking since, of course, Democrats reclaimed the White House. This one assumes, of course, that Joe Biden won. Of course, he leads Donald Trump by the popular vote of 3.6%. So that is the case, while House Democrats are ahead by only 2%. So you can see this margin shows again the difference between the enthusiasm for Joe Biden and the lack of enthusiasm for the House, because they go on to point out that this margin is really even more exaggerated given the fact that there were a number of Democratic seats that went uncontested. Sometimes Republicans say this one is so gerrymandered, there's no way that we can possibly win that. But again, don't forget, we're now going to have these various seats gerrymandered again, because now that the census has taken place, there are going to be an increase in the number of congressional seats in Texas, for example, and a decrease in some of these other blue states. So we'll talk about that in just a minute. But again, the editors went on to remind us of something we've already mentioned on the program, and he says that Democrats are now brawling over the reason, with progressives and swing state members blaming each other. You have the leader of the squad, if you will, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, blaming her colleagues for defeat for not knowing how to run smart digital campaigns. Meanwhile, you have all sorts of swing state Democrats who say, if nothing else, some of these ads run against them, talking about socialism, defunding the police, raising taxes, eliminating oil and gas drilling, did not help them. And it really comes down to a lot more than merely packaging, which brings us to one of the points, because they actually, in this article, remind us that the House never voted to defund the police. True. But member after member indulged the Black Lives Matter movement, in which they want police budgets to be slashed, and point out one Democrat from Staten Island, that'd be Representative Max Rose, or former Representative Max Rose, who was in a BLM march, and that was featured in an ad that the Republican ran against him. So that, again, is the issue. And then they conclude that the problem isn't the Democratic message, it's the reality of their program. They said you can disguise your policies by not calling them socialist, but voters will still eventually figure out what those policies mean in practice. They know the Green New Deal means more expensive energy and an end to fracking. They know that Nancy Pelosi refusing Mr. Trump's offer of even $1.8 trillion in COVID relief is too little illustrates the kind of spending that they expect to actually take place in the House of Representatives. They also know that Senate Democrats talked openly about ending the legislative filibuster, that House and Senate Democrats advocating packing the Supreme Court. And so they say, no wonder more Republicans in the House and Senate actually find themselves looking at the same data with a very different kind of perspective. Which brings me to my second article, which we'll talk about just before the break, and it's by Byron York, political correspondent, individual's been on the program with us before, in which he says, defund the police and the damage done. Because he says, remember the debate about the meaning of the phrase defund the police, because it was repeated over and over again, and it certainly meant that cities should no longer fund and thus effectively abolish their police forces. But Democrats, he said, worried that embracing such a radical proposal might hurt them politically, so they actually said, no, that's not what it means. It was meaning just simply to redirect some of the funds from police to things like mental health treatment and affordable housing. Nothing too radical. His next paragraph says, though, every time, though, Democrats thought they had limited the political damage done by the literal interpretation of defund the police, some progressive voice would mess it all up. For example, in June, the New York Times published an op-ed entitled, "Yes, we mean literally abolish the police." And people picked up on that. I'll skip a couple of paragraphs here. Near the end there, he says, but the tragic thing is the cause of defunding the police is killing real people. Look at the new report from the Washington Post from Minneapolis, one of the nation's centers of anti-police activism. The story says that Minneapolis violence surges as police officers leave department in droves. Homicides in Minneapolis are up 50%, according to the story, with 75 people killed across the city so far this year. More than 500 people have been shot, the highest number in more than a decade, and twice as many as in 2019. And there have been more than 4,600 violent crimes, including hundreds of carjackings and robberies, a 5-year high. And he says all you have to do is remember back on June 26th, the Minneapolis City Council voted unanimously to abolish the city's police department and to create something called the Department of Community Safety and Violence Prevention, which would provide public safety services prioritizing a holistic, public health-oriented approach. And, of course, it points out that they have such a difficult time now in finding police officers because the city has budgeted about 888 officers. More than 100 of them have already retired. And so the other day, they came in front of that same city council and said, you've got to do something. So the city council, at this case, that had abolished the police force, decided to give $500,000 in emergency funding to allow for the hiring of temporary officers to get the city through the end of the year. Defund the police has a meaning. Every time somebody said, no, it's not literal, just go to Minneapolis and see how literal it was. And now the city council that tried to completely defund the police department had to come up with $500,000 just as a Band-Aid to keep people from getting killed. If nothing else, it illustrates again that words do have consequences. So do elections. We'll be right back.
Election day has come and gone, so tell me, do people like you need to be more or less vigilant, more or less informed, more or less involved in making an impact? I think the answer is clear. Those who value freedom of conscience and religious liberty need to do more than ever to stand up for what the founders gave us and put America on track for greatness. Yes, we face challenges, but it's in the hard times that the greatest victories are seized and won. I urge you today, right now, to seize this opportunity and join the Point of View Radio Truth Team. Be part of the solution our nation needs. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. The election is not the end of anything. It's another beginning. And when you join the Truth Team, you make it possible for millions of people to get the real news they desperately need and the practical marching orders that Kerby and the team at Point of View Radio give each day. Join us now in this critical moment. Pointofview.net/team. and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Now, for a few minutes, I want to try something out. I was just telling my producer, Steve, that sometimes I like to try something out on the program here and then turn it into a Viewpoints commentary. So I'll get a thumbs up or a thumb down probably from Andrew and Steve here in just a minute. But it has to do with what many people are calling the chump effect. Now, the chump effect has got a different definition. Back a number of years ago, Andrew Ferguson wrote about the chump effect, in which he was talking about the fact that that is the tendency for us as chumps to swallow uncritically all the claims of social scientists. But the way I'm going to use it has to do with a very good article written by James Meggs. I first heard about it through Kyle Smith, of all things. James Meggs is interesting because he used to be the editor of Popular Mechanics. You got to love a guy that knows how to take apart an engine, but also has great philosophy. And it reminds me a little bit of Mike Rowe. You know, on the one hand, if you've ever watched Dirty Jobs, he's real good at dealing with the dirty jobs. The next minute, you're getting a little bit of philosophy. Anyway, the point he's making is this, is that a lot of us are being made to feel like chumps because we recognize that the rules apply to one group but not to everyone. And a good example that he opens with is that this video has been going around ever since Elizabeth Warren ran for the presidency, in which Elizabeth Warren was talking about trying to forgive student loans. So a man approached Senator Warren by saying, "My daughter is getting out of school. I've saved all my money so that she doesn't have any student loans. Am I going to get my money back?" And she says, "Well, of course not." And the guy's response is, "So you're going to pay for people who didn't save any money, and those of us who did the right thing get," and he used a word I won't use on radio. And then when she's just, no, of course not. And she just almost like rolls her eyes. He says, "You're laughing at me," because she waved off his concerns. "That's exactly what you're doing. We did the right thing, and we get," and again, the word. And the point he's making is that sometimes you get the feeling, and we've talked about this in many situations, and it's starting to surface very significantly now as you're starting to see people with lockdowns. Because you know as well as I do that trying to cancel Thanksgiving in Chicago and Los Angeles and in San Francisco and maybe New York City is not going to necessarily work, but it especially will not work for the people that need to actually be a part of that. And there are all sorts of pictures now showing the mayor of Chicago out on the street with people that aren't wearing masks, and she's got a bullhorn. And there's a picture of the mayor of Washington, D.C., leaving Washington, D.C., going to Delaware for a celebration of Joe Biden, and yet not having to then quarantine for 14 days. You know all of that. And the point that James Meggs is making is people feel like chumps when they believe they're being played a game of rules only to discover the game is rigged. And he points out the word chump really derives from this ancient Norse term for a stump or a chunk of wood, from which we get the word blockhead, which if you've ever loved the Peanuts cartoon strips, Lucy's favorite label for Charlie Brown was what? "You blockhead." And you can remember how many times Lucy would hold the football out and Charlie Brown was supposed to kick the football, right? You remember this? How many times did she actually keep the football in front of him? Never. He was a total chump or blockhead. And the point that James Meggs is pointing out is, he says, the feeling when you're inching forward in the freeway exit lane, say, and another driver flies past and swerves onto the ramp at the last second, or when your child has to complete her college entrance exams within a designated time period, but your neighbor's child gets twice as long because they're suddenly diagnosed with learning disability. When you pay extra to have your pet travel in the airplane's cargo hold, but the yipping poodle across the aisle is an emotional support animal, gets to ride on the owner's lap for free. And, you get all of those kinds of things. And he says, the problem with that is that our lives, our civilization, rest upon thousands of norms and rules and traditions, like not going in front of people in line. And some of it involves laws like paying taxes, not littering. Others are more informal. But again, we all just get a little bit frustrated, as you might know, when you feel like you're being played as a chump. And the reason this works is because Most of us follow the rules, and then the few that don't. This would obviously fall apart if all of the parents told everybody that all of the children had to get twice as much time on their exams. You see what I'm going with this? This wouldn't work if all the people that wanted to take their dogs with them all actually began to say that these were actually emotional support animals, which, by the way, as he points out in this article here, is one of the reasons why the airlines and the restaurants are starting to say, okay, enough is enough. You know, the guy that tried to get in there, did you see that with a miniature horse onto the airplane and some of this? I mean, this has gotten, of course, out of hand. And so the point he's making is this. Having a compassionate safety net for the poor does not in itself turn other people into chumps. The problem arises when anti-poverty programs make it more attractive to stay on public assistance than to become self-reliant. When poorly structured incentives towards dependence and penalized work, strivers wonder, why do I bother? Of course, not all benefit programs are aimed at the poor. Various farm subsidies cost U.S. taxpayers more than $20 billion a year. Most of that money goes to the largest and wealthiest agricultural producers. Meanwhile, most farmers, just like most business people, somehow survive without tapping into this giant federal slush fund. And so he points out, and since he is in New York City, you see all sorts of people just jumping across the turnstiles when they go on the subway. And yet he says virtually all transit riders pay their fares. Most students are reasonably well behaved, even in the toughest schools. Most people protesting George Floyd's killing really have been peaceful. But when authorities downplay or ignore violations of these norms, it sends an unmistakable message to the principal majority. We take you for granted. Our sympathies are with the transgressors. And so he says, to be clear, not everyone who benefits from chump effect policies is a slacker or a selfish rule breaker. People in general need to have every right to sign up for anti-poverty programs, just as farmers who receive federal aid are simply working within the existing system. Not is it unethical for people to take advantage of tax breaks or members of public employee unions to actually enjoy their lavish pensions. But the point he's making is that what we have taking place right now is more and more individuals are gaming the system. And it used to be, okay, the elites got away with it. And we've been talking about this for some time. And I've said before that if you are running for office in the next couple of years, just simply having a slogan that says, I'm going to require that I have to live under the same laws you do, everybody always assumed that that would be the case, but that is not exactly how it's being played out right now. But what James Meigs is really pointing out is something much more sinister and even more devastating to our society, because it isn't just now the elites, it isn't just the mayors and the governors that are saying, well, you have to follow these lockdown procedures, but we do not. It isn't just the individuals who, in one way or another, benefiting from some of these various tax breaks. It is more and more people that are like the individuals jumping the turnstiles there and actually not paying for the subway. And so the costs get higher and higher. Another aspect of that we can see right here in Dallas, and we can see it nationwide. There are more and more district attorneys that are saying it's really not worth prosecuting any kind of theft below a certain amount. Sometimes they say $500, sometimes they say $1,000. And so as a result, it is sort of the I dare you to break my windows. It's just the flip side of the broken window theory that simply says, you know what? We're not going to punish this kind of action. We're not going to punish freeloaders. We're not going to punish criminals except when it is going to be economically advantageous. And as a result, you begin to see more and more social anarchy beginning to creep into society. And I think what is going to possibly happen, if we don't find at least some individuals in positions of authority being willing to implement those rules, is that you're going to have more and more social anarchy. And it's pretty obvious because we've all been around a family where the parents say, now, Johnny, I warned you not to do this. Johnny, that's my second warning. Johnny, number 3. And by that time, you don't want to punish Johnny. You want to punish the parents. Because when there isn't any authority, when there isn't any rules, everybody begins to think, I am following the rules, but everybody who's not following the rules is benefiting. Maybe I need to stop following the rules as well. So anyway, I thought the chump effect is something I might write a commentary about, but it was kind of intriguing just to think of all the times when you felt like a chump, when you tried to follow the rules and you looked around and noticed people on the freeway, people on the subway, people in your community didn't follow the rules, and they did better than you did. Only takes so long for you to say, maybe I shouldn't follow the rules either. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Another thing I'd like to try out is the catchphrase, without evidence. And I was just the other day, Channel 8, watching Teresa Woodard, and at one point made the statement you've heard so many times before: the Trump campaign, without evidence, argues that there was voter fraud. And I'm thinking, without evidence, really? I mean, Teresa, come on, are you sure you do not know that there are hundreds of affidavits which people have sworn to under threat of perjury that such things happened? Are you not aware of the fact that there are some very significant irregularities? And then I realized, well, okay, she's reading a teleprompter. I'm not sure she even wrote it necessarily, and it's not even sure that a person that wrote it even is aware of any of that. And but yet it was kind of like, well, didn't you get the memo? Because we've gone from a time in which people say there's no evidence of voter fraud to seeing all sorts of articles now surfacing saying, well, there's no evidence of widespread voter fraud. And I found one the other day in USA Today, there's no evidence of massive voter fraud. Okay. So then to keep playing this game that there's no voter fraud, I'll get into some of that next hour. But it got me thinking about this catchphrase, no, without evidence. And it turns out there was a very good piece in National Public Radio. One of the reasons why you got to love NPR still, in terms of some of the mainstream press, is there is a self-corrective nature to that. And Kelly McBride, I think she's the public editor for NPR, graduate of Gonzaga, if I remember right, from Spokane. But nevertheless, she actually wrote a piece a couple of months ago because she was noticing that all of her fellow NPR reporters were using this phrase without evidence. Now, by the way, I don't have a problem with using the phrase if you would use it impartially, but every example she uses here is a good example of whenever the president says something, Donald Trump says without evidence, fill in the blank, okay? Without evidence would be appropriate if you were to actually critique some things, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said without evidence that the world will end in 12 years unless we deal with climate change. Okay, that'd be appropriate. Are we ever going to hear that? Nah. Black Lives Matter states without evidence that systemic racism exists all over the United States. Are we ever going to hear that? Of course not, because, again, part of critical race theory, you just simply assert it. You don't have to provide evidence. Matter of fact, if somebody provides counter evidence, it's due to the fact that the whole system is structured. You don't have to defend it. It's basically you can't even refute the idea of systemic racism. So I would recognize that sometimes the phrase without evidence might be worthwhile, but it's only used in one direction, and Kelly McBride talks about this. She says, when a reporter asked President Donald Trump, this goes back a couple of months, for his thoughts on the teenager who shot 2 protesters and injured a third in Kenosha, Wisconsin, Trump said it looked like self-defense. And so the lead story at NPR was Trump claimed, without evidence, that it appears the gunman was acting in self-defense. And she points out that without evidence shows up a lot in conjunction with things that Donald Trump says. It's previously pointed out that it's insufficient when reporting on the administration's claim that mail-in ballots are vulnerable to counterfeiting. So again, one of the statements by one of the editors at NPR, it's not the first time Trump has said, without evidence, that voting by mail is more vulnerable to fraud or that it helps Democrats. And what I appreciate is that she now quotes from one of the other individuals who is writing into them using the phrase so often on Morning Edition to simply say, wait a minute, it isn't that there is absence of evidence, but that evidence can be interpreted different ways. And the evidence may be confusing or inconclusive, but the evidence still exists. And so it's inaccurate to say, and this, of course, goes back to some things being said back in September, that this is without evidence. And yet this phrase now has become part of the, if you will, journalistic lexicon, without evidence. And as I've said before, maybe sometimes that would be appropriate. Entirely too many individuals on both sides of the aisle make statements, but they don't provide any evidence for it. They don't provide context for it. They don't even point to it. And again, this is something that is so troubling when people are obviously in a big rush to try to get the information they get. And a very significant number of individuals aren't listening even to NPR. They're not listening to Point of View. They're not watching ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN. They're getting a lot of their news from Facebook, which is about the worst. Well, no, Wikipedia might be worse, but okay, one of the worst places to get your news. And so this phrase that is now being used all the time without evidence. But again, I appreciate the fact that Kelly McBride points out that it's really being used primarily with the president. And of course, if indeed he is now becoming a private citizen, they may not spend any time talking about his statements or his tweets. Although they're going to need something, because if they want to create some controversy, they're going to certainly look for that. But the point is that a lot of these phrases about without evidence is not the case. And let's just go back and take a couple of those. First of all, the president claimed without evidence that the gunman appeared to be acting in self-defense. If you watch that video of Kenosha, you can see that he was knocked down. A person was about ready to hit him over the head with a skateboard. There was another individual that had a gun and also was trying to take his gun. That gets pretty close to self-defense. And again, that whole statement was without evidence. How about the one that Trump said without evidence that voting by mail is more vulnerable to fraud or that it helps Democrats? Why would he say that? Oh, maybe because, as we've pointed out on this program more than once, that's exactly what individuals who were at one time arguing against voter IDs for why we need to not have voter IDs, because they were arguing at the time when they did not want voter IDs. These would be people on the left, that we shouldn't require people to have voter IDs because voting in person is not as maybe vulnerable to fraud as voting by mail. So both on the left and the right have said that, and I mentioned even a very important decision that came down from James Ho, who is a judge that sits on the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, in which he went back and even picked out many of those statements made by these various groups that voting by mail is more likely to be fraudulent. And so, again, these phrases are oftentimes just sort of catchphrases being used. So 3 cheers for Kelly McBride, understanding that this phrase, without evidence, was getting to be overused in August and September. And I fear it's going to get used all the time, and it's almost impossible to listen to a broadcast now without somebody, especially if it's said by the Trump campaign or by Donald Trump or even Mike Pence or by some of the individuals we quoted yesterday, to actually use the phrase without evidence. And so you sometimes wonder, what is that evidence? Well, the evidence is out there, and there is a lot of evidence that will be presented in the courts this week. And if indeed it turns out to be faulty evidence, it's still evidence. It's not without evidence. It might be evidence you disagree with. It might be evidence that was poorly put together. It might be anecdotal evidence and not statistical evidence, but it is evidence. And so this phrase, without evidence, needs to be removed from the lexicon of so many individuals who use this to simply take a shot at Donald Trump or people that they don't like, because it isn't the absence of evidence. At the worst, it's a difference in terms of the interpretation of some of that evidence. And in most cases, there's pretty significant evidence that is oftentimes ignored when those statements are made. Anyway, let's take a break, because when we come back, we're going to spend some time with our good friend, George Barna. We're going to talk about the real Civil War in America, how to win it, and who must lead it. And that's one of a couple of articles we're going to look at, and we've posted those on the website. And we will be back right after these important messages.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
We're going to be talking now with our friend George Barna, who is professor of Arizona Christian University and also president of the Cultural Research Center. If you've been listening to Point of View, you know that we've been working our way through what is called the American Worldview Inventory of 2020, based on 51 different worldview-related questions. Today we'll look at Americans redefining and customizing Christianity and summarize some of that, but move also to the next piece, which is Worldview, the Real Civil War in America, how to win it, and who must lead us back, because this will help us understand what to do in the future. So we have been trying to give you over these many months an analysis of kind of the state of American Christianity, and then looking forward to what we need to do next. Of course, George Barna, as I said, is the president of the Cultural Research Center. We've posted both of these articles for you to find on the website. He, in the past, of course, founded the Barna Group, and as an individual that has provided so much input and perspective on what is happening in American Christianity. So welcome back to Point of View, George Barna.
Well, thanks, Kerby. Always good to be with you.
Let's, if I can, for just a minute, talk about that study that, in a sense, is a summary of your American Worldview Inventory, because you talk about the fact that people are redefining and customizing Christianity. I've used the illustration, I think you agree with it as well. It's kind of like going through a cafeteria line. You're picking from here and there and everything, and there's a sense in which there are individuals who are Christians, maybe in their commitment, but in terms of their worldview, aren't really thinking like Christians because they've borrowed from the world, haven't they?
Yeah, it's true. I mean, really what we've got is a cut and paste mentality where we're exposed to so many different opportunities. What we tend to do is pick not even on the basis of intellect, but on the basis of how particular worldview elements make us feel. And so when you look at the worldview of most Americans, it really is a blending of many different points of view. I'll tell you, Kerby, I've been doing this kind of research for more than 25 years on people's worldviews, and I have yet to interview my first American who has a pure worldview. We all have elements of various things in there. So, yeah, what's happening now is that balance is shifting, and more of what we're buying into is not from the Bible, but it's from the world.
And again, some of those surface on even the kind of the hot button issues. 44% claim the Bible is ambiguous in its teaching about abortion. 34% argue that abortion is morally acceptable if it spares the mother from financial, emotional hardship. 34% reject the idea that marriage is one man and one woman. That maybe, if nothing else, kind of leads into something else we're going to be talking about in just a minute, and that is maybe explain some of the voting behavior, doesn't it?
Well, it does. And let me point out something that I think is pretty startling. Those numbers that you just identified are from people who attend evangelical churches.
Yes.
That's not the population at large. And so, you look at evangelicals and we break it out by Pentecostals, and we look at mainline Protestants, we look at Catholics. Those numbers become even more alarming as we move down that line, theologically speaking. So, yeah, I mean, the reason why we study worldview is because it's your decision-making center as a human being. It's kind of like a computer has an operating system, maybe it's Windows or whatever Apple uses, and human beings have a worldview. That's their operating system that causes them to make their choices. So when you look at the results of the recent election, we can trace it back to what people believe as their worldview. That's the basis on which they cast their votes. That's the basis on which they're identifying what kind of future they want America to have and what kind of role they want to play in it.
And again, one of the other things that comes from, again, those attending evangelical churches is 3/4, 75% believe that people are basically good. Now, George, I wrote a piece the other day on kind of a biblical view of the liberal mind, and I did that because I wanted people to understand that there are reasons why people hold to very leftist liberal ideas, and one of the key ones was this idea that people are basically good. And if you believe that people are basically good, then you have no problem with a bureaucrat in Washington, D.C. making choices for you about what kind of health care plan you can have, what kind of drugs are available to you, all sorts of regulations and those kinds of things. If you feel that people are basically good, then a lot of the checks and balances that we have in our government, which were trying to protect us from sinful behavior and ambitious people, aren't necessarily important anymore. And so there are some very definite, if you will, real-world consequences to some of these ideas that you've surfaced through your American worldview inventory, isn't there?
Well, absolutely true. And in fact, so many Christians around the country rue the fact that it's more and more difficult to have a conversation with people about faith, and especially to talk to them about salvation. And what they don't realize is that people aren't interested in talking about salvation in America because they don't believe they have a sin problem.
Right.
And if they don't have a sin problem,
yes,
what do they need a Savior for? And so you start to put all of these things together, and for a lot of people, as we explain it to them, the light bulbs go on and they say, oh, now I get it. It's not just a personal rejection of my church or me or my inability to communicate. They've got a major stumbling block that's a foundation in their mind and their heart that says, well, that's interesting, but it's not a problem for me.
Yes. When I come back from the break, I want to talk about this idea of the real Civil War. But since we did mention the mainline Protestants, that was something else that I was thinking very arresting, because when you look at those individuals that tend to be more in what are called the mainline Protestant denominations, liberal Protestant denominations, what you found is that when you looked at some of those, they held a view or engaged in a behavior at odds with biblical teaching more than 3 times the number of the biblical conflicts you identified with either evangelicals or Pentecostals. So as you said, it's almost like a slope, and it slides down dramatically when you get to some of those liberal denominations, doesn't it?
Yeah, it sure does. And, we identified other patterns there with people who attend mainline Protestant churches, and often they don't realize that they're in a church that's not necessarily teaching what the Bible teaches. And so that's why I think some of this research may be eye-opening for a lot of different people.
Well, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, one of the other articles I've posted here, The Real Civil War, which is Worldview, How to Win It, and Who Must Lead Us Back. And a very good piece by George Barna. And if you find yourself saying, okay, you rattled off some of those facts and figures and statistics, I want to read them for myself, that article is up there, Americans Redefining and Customizing Christianity. And so I would encourage you to get that. And then also we have this one, Worldview, The Real Civil War in America, How to Win It, and Who Must Lead It. And if you click on those articles, you'll find that information. Or if you simply click on the picture of George Barna, it will take you to the Cultural Research Center. I would encourage you, if you haven't taken the time to go there, there's a place where you can click to get the findings. And I think you're going to find this very helpful, especially as you want to try to explain this to friends, neighbors, and coworkers. If you're a pastor or a Christian leader, I really encourage you to get that material there as well, because it's going to be very helpful for you to understand what you need to do in your church and in your community. But when we'll come back, we'll talk about what about this idea of a civil war with George Barna right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Yesterday, I ended my commentary by saying that you should trust your own judgment. Many of the so-called experts really don't understand your world, even though they have great power in the media and politics to control you. I think it is time to realize that censorship is going to happen, especially on social media platforms like Twitter, and plan accordingly. Last month, the Senate Commerce Committee held hearings on the topic of online speech. Jack Dorsey, who's the CEO of Twitter, appeared on screen with a long beard and long hair looking like he'd been living on the streets in San Francisco. The editors of the Wall Street Journal said he gave the impression that he could not care less about his company's abuse. One minute he denied they were silencing views contrary to his political beliefs. The next minute he seemed to contradict himself by arguing that they need to monitor what is being said in order to earn the trust of people using Twitter. Remember, this is the social media organization that shut down the account of the New York Post for weeks and blocked all links to their story about the business dealings of Hunter Biden. Here's the issue. If Twitter can shut down the account of the fourth largest newspaper in the country and the oldest newspaper founded by Alexander Hamilton, it can shut down you. Senator Ted Cruz asked, who elected you and put you in charge of what the media are allowed to report and what the American people are allowed to hear? We're just going to have to face the fact that Twitter and other social media platforms are not going to change, especially after the 2020 election results. Congress could change the Communications Decency Act that provided them with immunity from legal action, but there aren't enough members of Congress interested in amending the law. We need to find other ways to communicate because Twitter will continue to censor with virtual impunity. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
George Barna, my guest. If you'd like to join that conversation today, 1-800-351-1212. 1-800-351-1212. George Barna with, of course, the Cultural Research Center. Also, his most recent release, Restoring America by Reframing Its Worldview. And also this one on worldview, The Real Civil War in America, How to Win It and Who Must Lead Us Back. And so, George, in some respects, we've been giving a diagnosis for these many weeks that you've had on the program. Let's, if we can, kind of move ahead to the prescription. What can we do? And I guess the first obvious one is, what is this civil war that we find ourselves in America?
Well, you know, when you look at why people are at odds with each other, and it's not even just politically anymore. I mean, we find that economically, we find it spiritually. There are a lot of ways that we are now such a divided nation. The real civil war, though, is based on what it is that's dividing us, and it's our worldviews. On the one hand, you've got God's remnant, that 6%, who embrace a biblical worldview, who think biblically, who want to live biblically, and they don't want to see the country lose its standing, its strength, its greatness by transitioning into a nation that would be socialist, one that would be Marxist in its worldview orientation. And so, yeah, I mean, they've been standing up for biblical truth. But, of course, that's been controversial, and that's where we have the real battle that's waging.
And again, in this article on the real Civil War, it also refers to, and I'm holding this up for some others, a previous one in which you found that the younger generation, the millennials, have radically different beliefs about respect, about faith, and about America. And George, one of the things we do on a pretty regular basis here is have a millennial roundtable. in part because we recognize not all millennials are listening to this radio program, but even if you are one, you will benefit from it. But if you aren't, you will benefit more because it helps us understand that this younger generation, whether it's Generation Y, the millennials, Generation Z, sometimes called the iGen generation or whatever, they have very different views about faith, about respect, about America, about things like capitalism and socialism. And that's really an educational challenge that we need to face in the 21st century, don't you think?
Oh, it sure is. Because, I mean, when we look at the data coming out of that portion of the study, and millennials in particular are interesting because, I mean, you know, they're taught these things. It wasn't just naturally ingrained. They had to be taught these things. So you have to go back and realize the influence of the schools, the influence of the media, the influence of government policies and laws. And that's what's led them to believe so many of these things. And so here we are as part of that civil war that you were alluding to. You know, we've got a whole generation that says the only people I'm going to consistently respect are those who hold the same religious and political views that I do. And then you look at where they're coming from in terms of faith, and they're disengaging with Christianity in record numbers. They are the largest portion of this segment of the population that I call the don'ts, those who don't believe, don't care, don't know, referencing their views about God, His existence, and His power and authority. And so, you know, they're saying, no, I'm not going to go the Christian way. And then when you look at their views about America, they're the group that's leading the charge towards socialism. They're the group that, you know, has a whole different view about what politics should be and what role people should play in it. And so, yeah, I think there needs to be that kind of conversation where people with more experience get to talk with them, hopefully not in a hostile environment, about what matters. How do we think about these things? Why do we believe what we believe? And let's take a look at what you believe and some of the implications of that. We can learn from each other, but we both got to have open minds.
You know, I grew up at a time when they were talking about a generation gap between those born before the end of World War II and the baby boomers. They called that the generation gap. But you say the largest generation gap really is between millennials and boomers. And here's some great examples. 28 percentage points less likely. Millennials are 28 percentage points less likely than boomers to say they treat other people the same way they want to be treated. That's kind of the golden rule, isn't it? I mean, that's Matthew 7, and that's not just in the Bible. It's in all sorts of other major religions. They're also 28% less likely than boomers to be gracious, or put it another way, 28% more likely to have a vengeful point of view. This is kind of interesting because your argument is that millennials may be the least tolerant generation we've had in America, and that's not necessarily the popular media persuasion, is it?
Oh, no, not at all. But, yeah, I mean, the research shows that, I think, pretty convincingly. And so for us to buy into the media narrative about, you know what, give these young people a break because they're loving, they're accepting, they're tolerant, they're understanding, you know, but then you have some personal experiences on college campuses or in the streets or wherever, and oftentimes it's different. Not the entire generation, but, you know, we're talking about the norms here for a particular generation. And so once again, I think it's important that we have a realistic view of what we have to work with here. They do not buy many of the most common biblical precepts in terms of honesty and integrity and respect and dignity. And yet at the same time, they believe that, you know, because there is no absolute moral truth in their minds, you can't call them out for those things. You can't suggest that there's anything wrong with that. And so really there's no quick fix to this. And that's why it's become this kind of civil war, is you can't simply put a couple of pieces of information on the table and say, yeah, but look at this, because the problem is much deeper than that.
Wow. Well, let's, if we can, talk about this idea of a worldview turnaround. And again, I have posted this article on the real Civil War in America. And you point out that a turnaround in worldview may be possible, but it won't be quick. But what are some steps that churches and even parents should take in order to bring that about?
You know, one of the things that I talk about in that article is that from a strategic point of view, We want to work with the people who have some of the cornerstones of a biblical worldview already in their hearts and minds. I call that group, the 19% of the population, the emergent followers. They get it to some extent. They really don't have a full biblical worldview, but there's something that we can build on. And so if we were to start with those people, next, let's then identify what are the biggest, the most glaring weaknesses in their worldview.
Mm-hmm.
And, we measure 8 different categories. The category of human nature and human character is one that we're really out to lunch on as a nation. And with emergent followers, if we started to rebuild their perspective about human nature and human character, and then went to the next category, which is biblical, the Bible and truth and morality, again, we're pretty weak in that area. But if we have an intentional and strategic approach to how we're going to reshape a person's worldview, we can begin to see some significant progress more quickly than otherwise.
Just before we go, let's talk about some of the resources available at the Cultural Research Center. I know you now have an opportunity for people to get the findings of the American Worldview Inventory, to get the complete report, and there are ways that they can sign up to receive these on a regular basis. So talk about, for our listeners that have not already signed up with the Cultural Research Center, what's available and what they can obtain.
Yeah, if they go to the website at culturalresearchcenter.com, they can read the reports, they can download the reports, but they can also sign up to have us send them the forthcoming reports. We're also in the process of producing additional resources, books and booklets, and there will be events, all kinds of things, as well as recommendations of other kinds of resources that relate to some of the issues that are being uncovered by the research. So if they go to culturalresearchcenter.com, they can get exposed to all of that.
And again, we have that link on a website, and you are free to go to our website, pointofview.net, to find that. In case you happen to be traveling, don't have a chance to write that down right now, it'll be up there. And we've posted 2 of the articles, one on, again, Americans redefining and customizing Christianity. Of course, we talked about the idea of restoring worldview, and then this one, The Real Civil War in America, How to Win It, and Who Must Lead Us Back. And for those of you that have an outreach to the millennial generation, one of the previous ones I was alluding to here, millennials have radically different beliefs about respect, faith, and America. So, Dr. George Barna, always great to have you on the program, and I look forward to the next opportunity.
Me too. Thanks so much, Kerby.
We're going to take a break. When we come back, I'm going to get into some other issues. But by the way, if anywhere along the way you find yourself saying, I'd like to make some comments about what I'm seeing as some of those trends. Certainly, George Barna is a trend watcher, but you may see trends in your own church, your own family that you would like to talk about as well. And so when we come back from the break, I'm going to get into a couple of the articles we've posted here. One that I put up especially yesterday, we talked about the 4 cities where Joe Biden seemed to do better than Hillary Clinton. I wanted to give you a counter to that. Some have said that he didn't do that well in some of those cities, so you've got a counterpoint between yesterday and today. And we'll come back and get into some of these other very important issues in the election and the recount. All that coming up right after this.
Election day has come and gone, so tell me, do people like you need to be more or less vigilant, more or less informed, more or less involved in making an impact? I think the answer is clear. Those who value freedom of conscience and religious liberty need to do more than ever to stand up for what the founders gave us and put America on track for greatness. Yes, we face challenges, but it's in the hard times that the greatest victories are seized and won. I urge you today, right now, to seize this opportunity and join the Point of View Radio Truth Team. Be part of the solution our nation needs. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. The election is not the end of anything. It's another beginning. And when you join the Truth Team, you make it possible for millions of people to get the real news they desperately need and the practical marching orders that Kerby and the team at Point of View Radio give each day. Join us now in this critical moment. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. We're going to get into some of the issues in the news. And most importantly, before this next hour is over, in about an hour from now, we'll have Ben Courson with us. We'll talk about being thankful during the holidays as we get closer to Thanksgiving and Christmas. Thought it would be appropriate to cover some of those issues as well. And we'll certainly talk about some of the commentaries that I have and a variety of others, but I thought I'd start out with a piece that actually I have not posted, although it's easy to find. It's by John Daniel Davidson, which was in the Federalist, in which he said Republicans have good reasons not to trust the election results. And he starts by saying, you know, if you read the press reports by especially the mainstream press about the throngs, he says, of President Trump supporters who rallied in Washington, D.C. over the weekend, you think the crowd was made up of a bunch of conspiracy theory-addled rubes and delusional far-right extremists. I'll come back to that in just a minute with another piece, but let me just mention that he says that the march came on the heels of a poll that was out last week that found a staggering 70% of Republicans now say they don't believe the presidential election was free and fair. That news, like news of self-described Million MAGA March, was met with a mixture of contempt, hysteria, and condescension, I should say, from Democrats and the media. And that's the first point you want to bring out, is that if you have a very significant number of individuals in the country who are wondering whether or not we had a fair election, you would seem like you would want to do everything you could to explain that it was fair, if it was, or to identify some places where there was fraud or there was any kind of voting irregularity, with the promise that you would try to fix that in the future, because the future of the republic is dependent upon everybody buying into the system. And when the system looks flawed to so many individuals, and this is not a small number, 70% of Republicans, I would love to know what that is nationwide, but that is the case. And so then he points out that, well, the reaction you get is, of course, sit down, be quiet, don't make any more comments about this, you don't know what you're talking about, or the front page, New York Times, election officials nationwide find no fraud. And he says this has been repeated everywhere, mantra-like. All claims of voter fraud or ballot counting irregularities, whether from President Trump or the tens of thousands who marched over the weekend, are baseless, unfounded, and have no evidence behind them. Now, first of all, I sometimes, when I see something like that, I always want to say to many of the writers, if I could meet them, who are you trying to convince, you or me? Because you are saying it with such stridency that it's almost illustrative of me that you don't necessarily believe it in your heart of heart as well. And so this is why he, in this particular place here, says the nervousness of the media's insistence that the election was pure as the driven snow. Maybe they seem so nervous because they know what everyone in America knows: there was nothing pure or secure or even ordinary about the election. What I have noticed, and I'm going to get to this in just a minute, is you got almost two narratives coming up at once. The first narrative was, no, there is no voter fraud, and that's the argument that has been made for years, Brennan Center and all sorts of others. And if it does exist, it's as rare as a unicorn, or maybe as mythical as a unicorn. Over the last couple of weeks, I've noticed enough evidence starting to surface with all these affidavits and all of these various stories and anecdotes to have people say, okay, maybe there was some voter fraud, but it was not widespread voter fraud. And then the other day, USA Today, there is no evidence of massive voter fraud. Okay, we are starting to move the goalposts a little bit here, aren't we? And the point is, as I have said from the very beginning, I think there is obviously fraud. We've had fraud that has taken place during the Democratic primaries. We had to actually reschedule an election. Once again, a judge had to step in on the 12th congressional district and just decide who was going to win because the evidence was so contradictory. 2 years ago, we had to run another election in the 9th Congressional District in North Carolina. So don't tell me we haven't had voter fraud, as we've talked about with Hans von Spakovsky, almost 1,300 examples. And these are just a sampling of voter fraud, and that's those kinds of things. But nevertheless, and I will come back to this idea, there is no evidence, because you're also starting to see the rise of this phrase, without evidence. It's a catchphrase that's been developed by the media, and I want to get into that in just a minute. But again, John Daniel Davidson says, look, states pushed ahead, mailing ballots to outdated voter rolls in mass, recklessly loosening oversight on how the ballots could be collected and counted. Chain of custody for absentee ballots went out the window, along with whatever meager safeguards usually apply to absentee voting. And so he says, no wonder there's scores of Republican poll watchers in Michigan that have filed sworn affidavits claiming tens of thousands of fraudulent ballots were counted for Biden in Detroit. No wonder that in Philadelphia, poll watchers reported that they were forcibly kept from observing the counting of absentee ballots as required under state law. We've got all of that pretty well documented. And again, if you swear on those documents through threat of perjury, probably pretty serious here. And then he goes on to point out some other things. Even more egregious than voter fraud and harder to redress are the cases where election bureaucrats or activist judges simply ignored restrictions that legislatures had passed into law. In Pennsylvania, for example, the state Supreme Court brushed off rules set by the lawmakers and extended a deadline for when absentee ballots could be received. Of course, we've talked about that before. Extending deadlines for absentee ballots is, of course, an invitation to break election laws. And he goes through some of the history of ballot stuffing and bribing judges and all this. I'll leave that. But he ends by simply saying, look, any reasonable person can look at these changes and conclude they created conditions ripe for fraud and abuse. Only the most naive, he says, Pollyannish observer would survey all of the above and conclude, as our mainstream media has, that there was no fraud in the election. Of course there was, and everyone knows it. Which brings me to something else I'm probably going to write a program on, or maybe at least a Viewpoints commentary, and it's this phrase, it's this catchphrase called without evidence. And to give credit where credit is due, Kelly McBride wrote about this back in September. She's the public editor for NPR. And what she was noticing is the number of NPR reporters that whenever they would have a statement by President Trump would say, President Trump says, without evidence. And of course, you've heard this before. One of those was, for example, Trump claimed without evidence that it appears that the young boy in Kenosha, Wisconsin, after being attacked, was acting in self-defense. Or a couple of others, Trump has said without evidence that voting by mail is more vulnerable to fraud. Again, she talks about this fact that the without evidence phrase has been used quite a bit. And of course, it was used back in August and September when she wrote the article. And of course, now we're seeing that phrase being used not just in the mainstream media, but even here locally. I was hearing reporters say the Trump campaign argues without evidence that there was voter fraud. What evidence do you need? All the various documents that have been filed, all the various court proceedings, all the questions raised about Dominion voting system. Of course, there's evidence. And she, I think, very fairly points out that one of the people writing in, who was a listener to NPR, writing in about Morning Edition, was actually making the case that, wait a minute, in many of these cases, it isn't that there's no evidence. It's that maybe the evidence could be interpreted differently, like you said, by blue and red. But it isn't that the evidence isn't there. It could be confusing. It could be inconclusive, but it still exists. So it's really inaccurate to say, for example, Donald Trump or the Trump administration that says this without evidence. The evidence is there, and you, in some respects, need to exercise some discernment. The more and more you hear this phrase, whatever, Trump administration says without evidence, Ted Cruz says without evidence, whatever, this phrase without evidence is become a catchphrase, and it's terribly misleading, and in most cases also inaccurate. Now, without evidence would be a good thing to use. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, without evidence, claims that the world will end in 12 years if we don't deal with climate change. Oh, okay, I like that one. Or Black Lives Matter claims, without evidence, that systematic and systemic racism is rampant in America. Okay, some of that might work, but of course we know how the game is played. Without evidence is always connected to Donald Trump or to the conservatives or to the Republicans or to Christians. And in most cases, there's evidence. It's just that you maybe ignore the evidence or disagree with the evidence, but that's not the absence of evidence. Just a little helpful hint while you're watching or reading, because after all, in this new world, we're going to have lots of discernment. I'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, I was talking about this idea of without evidence, and it's a phrase, a catchphrase being used all the time. And if nothing else, I certainly want to try to counteract that with what we do here at Point of View. And I was just looking, we have at least 5 articles that we have posted here today, which I'm going to read either this hour or next hour. Of course, we've covered 2 of those with George Barna, so that if you're listening, you say, well, wait a minute, where's your evidence for that? Where did you get that from? Where is that quote? Where is that statistic? It's on the website, pointofview.net. And I think you should demand that of other people that you are reading or listening to or watching, because there is a tendency more and more for people to just make flat statements without even trying to provide the evidence for it. And so it's reasonable to say, when somebody says without evidence, say, okay, here's the evidence. Because, again, it is going to be, I think, even more important for us here as the culture has changed, the political scene has changed, the media has become more invested in censorship, that you're going to have to really seek out and search out places for information. My commentary yesterday was talking about, should we trust the experts? Well, yes, if it's an expert that really is a true expert. As I said, a plumbing expert in my house is one I want if I got a water leak, and I certainly want a medical expert if I'm going to have somebody do surgery on me. I want a trained pilot if I'm flying from one city to the next. But some of these experts don't know anything about your life and live oftentimes in a bubble, but make all sorts of pronouncements. They may actually censor what you may or may not see in the social media area. They may write rules and regulations that adversely affect you because they have no idea what your life is like. And so my commentary today is about Twitter censorship. And again, we probably have now the best examples that we can possibly use, because if Twitter can shut down the Twitter account of the fourth largest newspaper in the country, the oldest newspaper founded by Alexander Hamilton, and it can shut down Senator Ted Cruz's website, and it can shut down the Trump campaign Twitter feed, I should say, they could certainly shut down yours. And so that's why I think it's going to be really important for you to get as much information as you possibly can. So those are the viewpoint commentaries for yesterday and for today. But I'll give you a preview of what is going to be in my viewpoints commentary tomorrow. And that is what I called culture war. And it sort of relates a little bit to some of the things we said with George Barna, but it also has to do with this intramural battle taking place right now in the Democratic Party, because there are a variety of individuals, both in the House and in the Senate, and even, I quote in there, a former Senator, Claire McCaskill, former Missouri Senator, who have been so critical of the fact that the Democrats spent so much time talking about guns, abortion, gay rights, transsexuals, socialism, and the like. And it brings me to actually a good setup for the first article we've posted today here on Point of View. And it's written by the editors of the Wall Street Journal with the provocative title, "Why Democrats Nearly Lost the House." To show you how close it is, the Democrats nearly did lose the majority, and it almost became a Republican majority. And this will now, if the trend continues, be the smallest House majority in the House of Representatives since 1919. Already, according to the editorial board, Democrats have already lost 8 seats and could lose as many as 13. And I'm not sure whether that includes, for example, Burgess Owens up there in Utah, because I think he's going to win. But it talks about losing 2 House seats in South Florida, 2 House seats in California, a number around the country, failing to pick up all sorts of seats in Texas, Ohio, and Florida. Some of you who are listeners in Texas or in Florida or Ohio, you know how the airwaves were just pummeled with all of these ads that were out there, and yet, interestingly enough, they were able to retain most of those seats, and so far they have about 26 seats that Democrats won with just 52% of the vote, which suggests that, given the fact that there was an overwhelming amount of turnout for, of course, people like Joe Biden, next time, they may not necessarily win re-election, because that turnout, which was dependent on keeping some of those Democrats in House, will change, which is why people like Kevin McCarthy, the House Minority Leader right now, is looking for the possibility that there could be a majority of Republicans 2 years from now, and he would be the Speaker of the House. And so in the midst of that, of course, this article talks about some of the brawling between the progressives and the swing state members. some of the, if you will, progressives, led by, for example, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, she just simply blamed the various House members who were defeated for not knowing how to run smart digital campaigns and how to sell progressive policies. But a lot of the swing state members of the House are saying, wait a minute, that's not the case. When we have found ourselves having to respond to ads talking about how Democrats are for socialism, defunding the police, raising taxes, eliminating oil and gas, even though they think some of this comes down to packaging, that's really not the case. I'm going to talk about this idea of defunding the police at the next hour, but I thought it was interesting that the editors of the Wall Street Journal put it this way. The House didn't vote to defund the police. Fair enough, truthful. But member after member indulged Black Lives Matter, the movement, which does want police budgets slashed. And they talk about Representative, or I guess I should say now former Representative Max Rose, Democrat from Staten Island, who joined a BLM march, and he was featured in a Republican ad and lost. And so the editors make this case, and it's a good one. The problem isn't the Democratic message, it's really the program. Yes, you can disguise your policies by not calling them socialist, but voters still, they say, eventually figure out what those policies mean in practice. They know the Green New Deal means more expensive energy and an end to fracking. They know that Nancy Pelosi refused Donald Trump's offer of even $1.8 trillion in COVID relief as too little. So they know what that means in terms of future spending. They also know that Senate Democrats talked openly about ending the legislative filibuster, and that House and Senate Democrats advocated packing the Supreme Court. And so no wonder they elected more Republicans in the House and Senate as a check on these policies. So, of course, the question is, what will happen in the future? And we'll have to leave it to the Democratic Party to figure out what lesson they learn or don't learn from this. But you can begin to see that, if nothing else, this is why there are a number of Republicans that are convinced that maybe in the next go-around, they might actually once again become the majority in the House of Representatives. And so that's our first article we've posted. And if you'd like to read it in its entirety, it is there. We come back from the break, though. What about this phrase, defund the police? Byron York, who's been on the program with us before, a political correspondent for the Washington Examiner, talks about the fact that defund the police is not just a phrase. There's a great deal of damage it has done. And for our listeners up there in Minneapolis, you've seen what has been happening in the city council, which is kind of intriguing because the city council voted unanimously to abolish the police department and create what was called the Department of Community Safety and Violence Prevention. But then when you had so many police officers leave the force, they all of a sudden now had to come up with $500,000 in emergency funding just to hire some temporary officers to get the city through the rest of the year. So words have consequences, elections have consequences. We'll talk about that. That's one of the other articles we've posted, and we'll get into some other very important issues that are part of our political conversation. And then we'll talk about what to be thankful during the holidays. All that coming up right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, we'll get back into some of the political issues, and then we're going to wind down with Ben Courson today, in which we're going to talk with him about being thankful during the holidays, and I think you're going to really appreciate that conversation with him. And for those of you that love science, I thought I'd mention this in the National Hour. I mentioned it in some other programs, but I don't think I've mentioned it here. If you go for a walk in the evening, and I tend to so often, sometimes with a flashlight, and other times just as dusk is setting, you have the chance to see all the solar planets in our solar system, all 7. Sorry, Pluto, you're not included. But, of course, anybody that's been out walking lately, of course, has seen Mars, which is right up there at the very top, Saturn and Jupiter. Matter of fact, they're going to have another one of their reunions here and have what's called the Great Conjunction. That is going to be really significant, and it's the closest brush those two planets have had with each other since 1623, so you might want to see that one again. And, of course, you have Mercury. Of course, I mentioned Mars. Of course, we'll mention the others. Venus, we've been able to see that one as well. And then, of course, Neptune and Uranus. And so it's something you just don't see very often. And so I just thought I might mention that as something that will be fun during these times as we get closer to Thanksgiving. We'll spend some time talking with Ben Courson. But again, love science, as you probably figured out, and great opportunity. Since I think most all of the people listening to this are in the northern hemisphere, but I can't say that for sure, because I know many people that listen on the internet or pick it up later off YouTube or something else might actually be in the southern hemisphere or in different parts of even North America or around the world where they can't see it. But nevertheless, for most of it, it's been kind of fun to look up and see all of those different planets. All right, let's get back to a couple of issues. I mentioned defund the police, and I thought this would be worthwhile because it's the second article I've posted here by Byron York, chief political correspondent for the Washington Examiner, in which he said, remember the debate over the meaning of the phrase defund the police? It was, as he said, repeated over and over again by the progressive left. It seems pretty clear that it meant that cities should no longer fund and thus effectively have, but instead should abolish, police forces. But some Democrats worried that embracing such a radical proposal, you think, might hurt them politically, so they suggested it actually meant redirecting some, but not all, funds from police to things like mental health treatment and affordable housing. Nothing too radical. Well, Byron York says just about every time Democrats thought they had limited the political damage done by the literal interpretation of defund the police, some progressive voice would mess it all up. For example, he says one particular op-ed that appeared in the New York Times had the headline, "Yes, we literally mean abolish the police." And so he goes on to point out that, indeed, Republicans tried to tie some of the Democrats to that. And the other day I quoted from the representative who's a Democrat from Virginia, Abigail Spanberger, who actually said the language of the streets are talking about defunding the police, defund police, open borders, socialism. It's killing us. And, of course, I just talked about how there's kind of an intramural battle right now between some of the more progressive Democrats that say, yeah, that's what we should be saying. We just need to position it better. And others that are saying, you keep saying this, and you will guarantee that we will be the minority party in the House of Representatives. Anyway, Byron York goes on to say, the tragic thing is that the cause of defunding the police is really killing real people. He says, look at the new report that just came out in the Washington Post from Minneapolis, one of the nation's centers of anti-police activism. The headline, or actually the statement, Minneapolis violence surges as police officers leave department in droves. If you read the article, here's just a couple of highlights, or lowlights is probably a better word. Homicides in Minneapolis are up 50%, with 75 people killed across the city so far this year. More than 500 people have been shot, the highest number in more than a decade, and twice as many as in 2019. And there have been more than 4,600 violent crimes, including hundreds of carjackings and robberies, which is a 5-year high. Now, Byron York says, okay, let's take you back. Remember June 26th, when the Minneapolis City Council voted unanimously to abolish the city's police department and instead created what was called the Department of Community Safety and Violence Prevention, with the idea that it would provide public safety services prioritizing a holistic, public health-oriented approach. Of course, he said, even though that probably from Byron York's perspective was absolutely insane, that's what the council did. And what has happened is that officers took the cue. And while the city has budgeted having 888 officers, more than 100 have already retired this year, and more than double, that's already, by the way, double the normal rate, and more are right now in the process of leaving. And so as a result, there are fewer officers able to patrol the streets, and it means less response to reports on crime. One community activist said the police are not as much a presence as they used to be. You think? Noting that sometimes when neighbors call 911, officers are delayed in responding, or they don't come at all. And last week, the police chief went to the city council to plead for more money. And so eventually, it took a little bit of time, the same council that voted unanimously to abolish the police force voted to give $500,000 in emergency funding to allow for the hiring of temporary officers in order to just get the city through the end of the year. And after that, of course, as Byron York says, who knows what happens. And so if nothing else, this is perhaps a case study in what some of the progressive governance really can do to a city when you look at what happened in Minneapolis. This is Midwestern common sense, and yet look at what has happened here. It was, of course, the campaign theme for Donald Trump. He lost, as far as most people assume, certainly lost in the popular vote, and we'll see where it comes on the electoral vote and some of these recounts and things like that. But the Republican candidates in the House warned against this, and they won. The Democrats tried to hide from this, and they lost. And so, if nothing else, we can see that it not only changed the outlook of the House of Representatives, prevented a blue wave from crashing on the shore of the United States Senate, and actually, more to the point, has devastated the lives of people living in Minneapolis. And so when you hear phrases like defund the police, they have a meaning. Words have a meaning. Elections have a meaning. And if nothing else, it was just another one of those case studies that we need to pay attention to. It's the second article on the website at pointofview.net. And if you'd like to get some of the facts and figures, maybe reprint it, put it in a Facebook post or a Twitter feed or something like that, feel free to do so. We come back, I want to talk just briefly about something I have mentioned, but not in the National Hour, and that is what sometimes is referred to as the chump effect. I think it's pretty fascinating because it illustrates why there are more and more people that are wondering whether or not the elite are getting away with things that the rest of us don't. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Yesterday, I ended my commentary by saying that you should trust your own judgment. Many of the so-called experts really don't understand your world, even though they have great power in the media and politics to control you. I think it is time to realize that censorship is going to happen, especially on social media platforms like Twitter, and plan accordingly. Last month, the Senate Commerce Committee held hearings on the topic of online speech. Jack Dorsey, who's the CEO of Twitter, appeared on screen with a long beard and long hair looking like he'd been living on the streets in San Francisco. The editors of the Wall Street Journal said he gave the impression that he could not care less about his company's abuse. One minute he denied they were silencing views contrary to his political beliefs. The next minute he seemed to contradict himself by arguing that they need to monitor what is being said in order to earn the trust of people using Twitter. Remember, this is the social media organization that shut down the account of the New York Post for weeks and blocked all links to their story about the business dealings of Hunter Biden. Here's the issue. If Twitter can shut down the account of the fourth largest newspaper in the country and the oldest newspaper founded by Alexander Hamilton, it can shut down you. Senator Ted Cruz asked, who elected you and put you in charge of what the media are allowed to report and what the American people are allowed to hear? We're just going to have to face the fact that Twitter and other social media platforms are not going to change, especially after the 2020 election results. Congress could change the Communications Decency Act that provided them with immunity from legal action, but there aren't enough members of Congress interested in amending the law. We need to find other ways to communicate because Twitter will continue to censor with virtual impunity. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about a phrase that I think we're going to hear more about, and I'm going to write a Viewpoints commentary on it, so I thought I'd try it out on you. And then we'll have Ben Courson with us as we talk about being thankful during the holidays. And the phrase that you will probably hear more and more about is the chump effect. Now, I might just point out that Andrew Ferguson first coined the term back in 2011, and back then he was really talking about how sometimes we swallow uncritically the claims of social scientists, so it makes us chumps. But this is being used in a different way by James Meggs. By the way, he's an individual who used to be the editor of Popular Mechanics, and just gotta love a guy that knows how to take apart an engine, but also can speak philosophically. You know, it's like Mike Rowe, you know, in Dirty Jobs. You know, one minute he's getting greasy and dirty, and the next minute he's giving you some quote from classical literature. Anyway, this is in the City Journal, which is actually something part of the Manhattan Institute, and you might remember Heather McDonald. But nevertheless, the chump effect is pretty easy to illustrate because he starts off by telling a story about Elizabeth Warren back when she was running for president, and she was in Iowa. And she was talking about spending more than $1 trillion to pay off student loan debt. Well, the man approached Senator Warren with this question. My daughter's getting out of school. I've saved all my money so that she doesn't have any student loans. Am I going to get my money back? And she looks at him and says, of course not. So he says, so you're going to pay for people who didn't save any money, and those of us who did the right thing are going to get, and he used a word I won't use on air. And so then she's even more like, I can't even believe you're asking this question. And so the point is, he said, finally, you're laughing at me. Yeah, that's exactly what you're doing. We did the right thing, and we get, and again, he uses that word. And the point he's making is you end up feeling like a chump. Again, James Megg puts it this way. The father was expressing an emotion growing more common these days. We feel like a chump. Feeling like a chump doesn't mean being upset that your taxes are rising or annoyed that you're missing out on some windfall. It's more visceral than that. People feel like chumps when they believe that they've played a game by the rules only to discover that the game is rigged. Not only are they losing, they realize, but their good sportsmanship is being exploited. The players flouting the rules are the ones getting the trophy. And so that is the example. James talks about this word chump really comes most likely from a Norse term for a stump or a large chunk of wood, from which we get our modern word blockhead. And if any of you are Peanuts fans, you might remember Charlie Brown. Lucy used to refer to Charlie Brown as what? A blockhead. And part of it is that Lucy never tired of snatching away the football. And Charlie fell for it every time. And I think you know the feeling. And so James Meggs gives us some examples. He says, you're inching forward in the freeway exit lane, and another driver flies past and serves onto the ramp in the last second. Or your child has to complete her college entrance exams within a designated time period, but your neighbor's child gets twice as long because of a suddenly diagnosed learning disability. When you have to pay extra to have your pet travel in the airplane's cargo hold, but the yippy poodle across the aisle, an emotional support animal, gets to ride on the owner's lap for free. And again, the point is you ultimately sort of feel like a chump. And so the point he's making is that there are thousands of norms and rules and traditions that really, if you think about it, make civilized life possible. And some of those, like paying taxes or not littering, are obviously enshrined in law, but others are sort of informal. And most of us take pride in adhering to some of those basic standards of etiquette and fairness, to say nothing about following the law. But we have a deep emotional investment in having people around us follow those norms as well. There's a reason we call some of that selfish, disruptive, or criminal behavior as antisocial, because we know if everyone stopped paying their taxes or started running red lights and shoplifting, our society would be on the way to collapse. Well, he goes on to say that it's bad enough when some random jerk makes you feel like a chump, but it's worse when government policies create entire classes of chumps. And he goes into some very good examples, but even modernly, as we're getting close here to the situation we find ourselves in right now, how many Thanksgiving dinners will take place a week from this Thursday? And how many of them will be canceled by the mayors or governors, the mayors of Chicago and New York, or the governors of New York and California, Illinois, Michigan, whatever it might be? And then how will we sometimes find out that they actually had a dinner or a time together? Or when we saw the mayor of Chicago decide to go out on the streets and celebrate with the Biden supporters, or you have the mayor of Washington, D.C. leave Washington, D.C. and go to Delaware to celebrate the Biden supporters and not have to actually quarantine for 14 days, you can see where that plays itself out. And so, again, David Meggs spends some time here, James Meggs, I should say, takes some time talking about chump effect policies take two forms. The first involves bestowing some financial or other benefit on a favored group. Often these groups are poor or considered victims of discrimination. And he said, now to be clear, having a compassionate safety net for the poor does not in itself turn other people into chumps. But the problem, he says, arises when anti-poverty programs make it more attractive to stay on public assistance than to become self-reliant. When poorly structured incentives reward dependence and penalize work, strivers wonder, why do I bother? And of course, not all benefit programs are aimed at the poor. Various farm subsidies cost U.S. taxpayers more than $20 billion a year. More of that money goes to the largest and wealthiest agricultural producers. Meantime, most farmers, just like most business people, somehow survive without tapping into a giant federal slush fund. And so then he talks about what happens when you start saying, well, we're just going to excuse crime. And the example he uses is that there was a decision in New York City no longer to penalize and punish individuals who would not pay the toll to go on the subway. And so he said virtually all transit riders pay their fares, and most students are reasonably well behaved, even in the toughest schools. Most people protesting George Floyd's killing really had been peaceful, but when authorities downplay or ignore violations of these norms and say, well, we're not going to punish somebody that actually shoplifts if it's less than $1,000, or we're not going to actually punish the protesters when they turn into rioters, you can kind of see what happens, because it sends an unmistakable message to the principled majority. We take you for granted, and we're going to be on the side of the transgressors. And so he says, to be clear, not everyone who benefits from chump effect policies is a slacker or a selfish rule breaker. People in genuine need have the right to sign up for anti-poverty programs, just as farmers who receive federal aid are simply working within the existing system. Nor is it unethical for people to take advantage of arcane tax breaks or for members of public employee unions to enjoy their lavish pensions. But when you start paying people for growing crops that nobody wants, you start giving tax loopholes to favored industries, and you start allowing there to be really a two-level playing field, this is where you start having some of those people who up until now have felt like chumps say, why am I going to continue to do this? If nothing else, maybe I would be wiser if I also would stop being so careful, so honest, playing by the rules, because after all, the people who don't play by the rules, they seem to be the ones that are succeeding. And if you want to understand what could happen in the future with that kind of mindset, it's the old argument that was made by Daniel Patrick Moynihan, the senator from New York, who talked about defining deviancy down. Once we start saying we're going to permit more and more illegal, immoral, unethical behavior and unlawful behavior, and the more we start defining deviancy down, we get more deviancy. And if you don't understand that, then I guess you just never been a parent, because I think we've all, even if you haven't been a parent, gone to a home where there's a parent that is not in charge and says, now, Johnny, don't do this. Johnny, I warned you once. Johnny, this is the third time I've had to warn you. And after a while, you don't want to punish the kid, you want to punish the parent, because once you allow this kind of behavior to extend into the society, you get more of it, not less of it. So there is a consequence to some of these policies and even some of these various individuals in positions of authority. And if more and more individuals start feeling like it's okay for the elite to get away with it, the so-called chumps and the chump effect are going to say, maybe I should get away with it too. And that can lead to social anarchy. Anyway, that's the chump effect. You're going to be hearing a lot more about it, and I thought I'd share it with you. When we come back, we're going to talk with our good friend Ben Courson about being thankful during the holidays. All that coming up right after this.
Election day has come and gone, so tell me, do people like you need to be more or less vigilant, more or less informed, more or less involved in making an impact? I think the answer is clear. Those who value freedom of conscience and religious liberty need to do more than ever to stand up for what the founders gave us and put America on track for greatness. Yes, we face challenges, but it's in the hard times that the greatest victories are seized and won. I urge you today, right now, to seize this opportunity and join the Point of View Radio Truth Team. Be part of the solution our nation needs. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. The election is not the end of anything. It's another beginning. And when you join the Truth Team, you make it possible for millions of people to get the real news they desperately need and the practical marching orders that Kerby and the team at Point of View Radio give each day. Join us now in this critical moment. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
You know, as we get closer to Thanksgiving, we should certainly be thankful, but I oftentimes have said that we should always have an attitude of gratitude, so we're going to be talking about that. And if you'd like to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212, or just sit back and maybe take some notes, because this would be something that you could use around the Thanksgiving table, assuming that your state will allow you to have a Thanksgiving table in light of what we just talked about a minute ago. And, of course, whether you gather just with your family or with others, this is certainly something that we should focus some time and attention on. Ben Courson's been with us before. He's a best-selling author, TV and radio personality, founder of Hope Generation, also the senior pastor of Applegate Christian Fellowship. If you remember his story, of course, he's an individual that really struggled with suicide and depression and has really been able to help others dealing with that as well, diagnosed with even a complex PTSD issue. And in the past, we've talked about Optimisfits, which is his book, and then one that came out last month, Flirting with Darkness. Ben Courson, always great to have you on the program.
Oh, what an honor to be back with you, my friend.
Let's, if we can, for just a minute before we get into thankfulness, do that first and mention the fact you got a new book out. And, of course, before you talked about this idea of optimism and the hope generation and all the rest. So let's talk about the positive first, then we'll come back and flirting with darkness, because in some respects you're bringing a message of hope as you are getting on an airplane or even while you're doing your TV and radio program. So talk about that.
Yeah, so there's one suicide every 40 seconds around the world. And since COVID, it's got even worse in the sense that one federal emergency hotline reports that this April, as juxtaposed against last April, there's a 1,000% increase of incoming calls for those in emotional distress. So we're living in a time where nearly half of Americans are saying that this COVID season has exacerbated their mental illness. So I really do believe in this. Like you said it, I'm heading on an airplane here in a few hours, because I just live and wake up every morning to give people hope. And that's what I'm so passionate about. And that's what Optimisfits and Flirting with Darkness is all about. It's about building hope in the face of depression and igniting a fierce rebellion against despair.
Let's, if we can, talk about the newest book. Came out in September, and we really never had a chance to talk to you about that, but this is one that is sort of a good follow-up to Optimisfits, in which you share your own battles, depression, PTSD, even your personal tragedy and things like that. So how in the world, I think some people could say, in light of even what you've been through, or in light of what they're going through, they could in some way or another have the kind of optimism and confidence as you. Really, that's kind of the theme of the book, isn't it?
Yeah, and you know what? It's all about reframing your pain. There's a psychiatrist named Daniel Amen who did 83,000 brain scans over a 22-year career.
Yes, I know who he is.
He did more brain scans than anybody else in history. And he said the single most significant discovery he and his colleagues made is that the brain can change. So I really believe we can be transformed by the renewing of our mind through neuroplasticity, where through rote and repetition, we continuously drive the grooves in our brain and our thoughts toward the light, toward hope, regardless of what we feel, because oftentimes our feelings lie to us. Antonio Damasio, a neuroscientist, said that 95% of the time our feelings decide for us. So we will opt for what feels good rather than what we know will be advantageous to or beneficial for us in the long run. So my whole thing is sometimes we have to fight for what we don't feel. We have to choose to count it all joy, because hope is a journey and joy is a choice. And I went through, a really dark depression, and I got out of it. And I really found that, I really believe we're forged by adversity, that through this soul-making theodicy, every challenge that we go through tempers our soul into iron and our spirit into steel if we'll retrain our brain and reframe our pain.
So good. Again, you can actually sound very intelligent with your friends talking about neuroplasticity. But again,
there it
is. The other part of this is the issue of always trust your emotions. The book, we've interviewed Jonathan Haidt, wrote the book Coddling of the American Mind, and one of those untruths that he talks about in the book is always trust your emotions. No, don't trust your emotions. And like you said, too many decisions are made on the basis of emotions without any kind of understanding of the rational reasons behind it, without applying a biblical worldview that we talked about earlier with George Barna. So these are some great resources. Again, if you're not familiar with Ben, we have a link to his website. You can find out both of his books, Optimisfits and Flirting with Darkness, and I think they would be great resources for you. But you may even know somebody right now kind of struggling with that. And I thought I would then pivot to some of the things I heard from some of your friends, the things you've been teaching on, and one of those is this gratitude attitude at especially a time of what you call thanks living. And if you think about this, we're heading into the holiday season, and you know as well as I do, Ben, that's when depression really begins to peak, doesn't it?
Yeah, 38% of people surveyed in one study said that their stress level increased during the holiday season. And so I think this can happen because of financial burdens, and sometimes getting around a lot of family members is warm in some cases, but stressful in other cases, or even loved ones that are no longer there, and it reminds you of your grief. And so I'm really a big believer in this idea of a gratitude attitude. You know, the Bible says, in everything give thanks. In everything give thanks. There's one, this is pretty cool actually. There's another study that found that people who generally practice gratitude or thanksgiving, they have greater sensitivity in their medial prefrontal cortex, greater neural sensitivity there, which is where decision-making and learning are in your brain. And also they tended to give more money to a cause, like generously. So it actually, gratitude impacts our life very profoundly. In fact, more scientific research has shown us that gratitude is very, very important for overcoming depression. It's simple thankfulness. And, there's this passage in Malachi where God says that those who speak words honoring my name, I hearken and I write those down, or I have them written down in a book of remembrance. Now, that word hearken in the Hebrew etymology is literally used of a dog whose ears perk up when hearing the voice of his master. So it's like God's ears perk up when we speak words honoring his name. And he has those written down in a book of remembrance. And so out of the 860.3 million words on average we speak in a lifetime, how many of those will be words of thankfulness? Because thankfulness and gratitude is massive when it comes to overcoming depression.
So again, this is the idea of a gratitude attitude. And again, in case you missed that just a minute ago, this is a very good article that came out recently that holidays, as you mentioned, add stress, that 88% of people claim they're more stressful during the holidays. So for those of you that are pastors or Sunday school teachers, small group leaders, fact or figure that is easily documented, you can find it at Fox News, and we could post it here on our website as well. But as we come to Thanksgiving, it's not just a holiday, but really it's an opportunity for us to develop a lifestyle. So what are you telling people in your congregation and people that are hearing you speak at various conferences?
Well, I'm a big believer that what the enemy means for evil, the Lord means for good. And that classic theme that God works all things together for the good is not just orthodoxy. It should be orthopraxy. And what I mean by that is it should change our life. When we put wheels on this thing, when we believe that we have a spoiler alert, as Revelation says, all tears will be wiped off our faces. And even in this political season, remembering that in 17 of the 22 chapters of Revelation, on roughly 45 occasions, it says that God is seated on a throne. And right now, a lot of people, they seem to be panicking and anxious and scared and fearful and even depressed and suicide ideation, despairing. What we have to remember is there's no Revelation revisionist history here. God is still on the throne. Nobody can coax the crown off his head or do a coup or steal his throne from him. You know, whatever political scheme might be going on, whether it's democracy or oligarchy or autocracy or tyranny or monarchy or whatever period of history we're in, we have to remember the theocracy, the reign of God, his kingdom coming as perfectly to earth as it is in heaven is our prayer. And the promise of Revelation is that he is still on the throne. All tears will be wiped off our faces, and that is a good reason to be thankful during this holiday season.
Let's take a break, and we will continue for just a few more minutes with Ben Courson, and we also encourage you to go to his website because it is very easy to find. You can simply go to our website, pointofview.net, or go to Ben Courson. It's Courson, but again, we have the link there, and you can find out more about his most recent book, Flirting with the Darkness. And one of the things we may talk about when we come back is just the idea of going outside, looking at the stars, and as I mentioned earlier, you can actually now, in the starry sky, see all 7 planets. Of course, it's very easy to see Mars. It's up highest most of all, and you can see Jupiter and Saturn, at least most of you in the continental United States. I'm not forgetting those of you up there in Alaska, but I think you can probably see some of these as well. And then, of course, in addition to Jupiter and Mars and Venus and all sorts of others, you can find all of the stars of our solar system in the night night sky, and that's a pretty unusual environment. And so we'll talk about things that we can do to be thankful for as we talk with our good friend Ben Courson. And if you'd like to know a little bit more about him, we have that link on our website so that you can find out more about his ministry, about his books, and maybe even schedule him to come and speak at your group. We'll take a break and come back with more about thankfulness right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Ben Courson with us for a few more minutes. Again, is an individual that is senior pastor at Applegate Christian Fellowship, author of Optimisfits and now Flirting with Darkness. And before we went to the break, one of the things I was saying, Ben, is you can go out and appreciate nature. I talked about almost anybody can go up and look at some of these planets and stars. As you and I have talked before, I make my way to Oregon every year. Don't seem to make it down to Medford and Jacksonville, but I'm going to get down there and see you face to face yet. And wherever you go to see God's creation, that's just another way in which we can be thankful as we go out and spend time in God's creation and thank Him for God's Word.
You know, I feel like I could talk about this forever, but first of all, please come and visit us in Medford. The stars are popping here at night when you go to the lake or you go to the mountains. You know, Psalm 8 says, "What is man that you are mindful of him? When I consider the stars, the work of your fingers, why would you give any thought toward me?" It connects you with a deeper reality. I really am a big fan of astrophysics. I love reading about like the strong nuclear forces, electromagnetism, and gravity, and the initial singularity that God created, which comes into existence, and a Higgs field slows down our quantum particles, from light speed so we can accrue mass. This whole astrophysical anomaly that is our universe is nothing short of a miracle. Einstein said, either you believe everything's a miracle or you believe nothing's a miracle. And I kind of want to spend my whole life helping people prove the former, that everything is a miracle. And if you think about it, when you look at the stars, there's about 6,000 stars that are visible to the naked eye, but there's actually more than 100 billion stars in our galaxy. And the current estimate is that there are 2 trillion galaxies out there. It's wild because the visible universe is roughly a million miles across. So we're part of something so galactic, galactonic, and massive. And I love looking at the stars because that's when, honestly, I have some of my best prayer times.
Well, again, this is a time not only to look at the stars, but all those planets and some really unique things happening, not the least of which is, since we're talking about stars for just a minute, this whole conjunction that is going to take place, because if nothing else, this is going to be something that we haven't seen very often. As a matter of fact, the last time both Saturn and Jupiter were this close together was 1623, and that was before Ben was born, so that's a few years ago. Let's, if we can, get into another reason to be thankful. Because in one of your messages, I know you talked about we should be thankful for God's faithfulness, for God's answered prayers. And you think about it, didn't Jesus heal 10 lepers and 9 kept going and only 1 returned? Shouldn't we be one of that 10%? What's your thought?
100%. We need to turn back to praise, not just because God deserves it and our destiny is to put him on full display and our teleologic design is to make much of him, but also because it just does us good. It's truly beneficial for and advantageous to us when we worship God, when we put him on full display like that. And what's really interesting is when we practice this sort of thanks living attitude, not just one day a year when we eat, stuffing, but every day when we practice this gratitude, it's hugely beneficial to us. And what we have to remember is, just like those lepers who were healed, all they had to do was ask. Jesus said, if your parents know how to give you good gifts and they're evil in comparison to the Father in heaven, how much more will God want to give you good gifts in the Holy Spirit to those who ask? Now, he used 3 examples to demonstrate what he meant, to show us that heaven is more ready to give than we are to ask. And as Luther said, prayer is not overcoming God's reluctance, it's laying hold of his willingness. Now, really quick, these 3 examples that he used, which really helped me to, in everything, give thanks with supplication and prayer rather than being anxious, so that the peace of God can guard my heart and my mind, is remembering these 3 examples Jesus used. So the first example he said is, which of you dads would give your son a stone if he asked for bread? Now, back then, the limestones geologically of Jesus' territory looked like loaves of bread, so you could trick a son and he'd break his teeth on that limestone. The second example he used is, which of you dads would give your son a snake if he asked for a fish? Now, that word snake can be translated eel or sea snake, sea serpent, and that was part of the forbidden food groups in the Levitical law. So a Jewish boy would be like, that's not the kind of seafood I can even eat. My dad tricked me. This is a tease and a ruse. The third example Jesus used is, which of you parents would give your son a scorpion if he asked for an egg? Now, there's actually a pale kind of scorpion in nature that when it's at rest, it rolls up into a ball and it looks like an egg. So no dad's going to say, Happy Easter, son, and then hand his kid a scorpion. And Jesus' point is that God doesn't want to trick us. God wants to give to us. He wants to gift us with the Holy Spirit, because every good and perfect gift comes from above, which is important to remember during this holiday season. And that helps me to pray with thanksgiving. And the more I give thanks, the more I remember he's been faithful in my past, so I can be faith-filled about the future and fulfilled today.
So again, those 3 examples, so good. Just before we run out of time, one of the other things I know that you've taught about is in Psalm 136, his love endures forever, or some of the translations, God's mercy endures forever. And that's just another reason to be thankful, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's funny because you're talking about the celestial anomalies right now with Jupiter and Saturn. We believe we found like 40 billion exoplanets that could be Earth-like in our galaxy alone. It's an amazing universe. And the psalmist in that chapter said, praise the Lord who made the sun and the moon, for his mercy endures forever. Praise God who made the stars, for his mercy endures forever. It's because of his mercy that we live in this wonderful universe. So that's why we need to reawaken our awe and wonder, and not just do the whole, I moved to Brooklyn, watch Letterman and The Simpsons, roll my eyes, and I'm a cynic. I think we're kind of tired of cynicism. What we need is more wonder, more hope, more awe, for his mercy endures forever.
Ben, just before we let you go, let's, if we can, and I mean go because you're going to be getting on an airplane, let's talk about your website, because that's where people can get a copy of your book, Flirting with Darkness, or they can find some of your teaching. You've got just some credible videos. They can, of course, watch various episodes, various radio programs, blogs, all sorts of other resources. But talk about what's available there, because I think, again, I want to expose your ministry to as many of our listeners as I possibly can.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, so my website's just bencourson.com, or you can type in Hope Generation on Google, on YouTube, on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. And for example, on YouTube, we have over 600 videos on our YouTube channel. You can also watch Hope Generation on TV, like Hillsong Channel and TBN and stuff. So yeah, we want to give hope galore to people and dole out sacred optimism, Jesus, joy, holy happiness, calm delight. So you can find that all at my website, bencourson.com.
So again, just some great resources that we can be talking about. And I just appreciate you taking the time, especially since you're going to be very busy over the next couple of days, giving us some time here at Point of View. And again, if you would like to know a little bit more about the gratitude attitude, thanks living, and even some of the ways in which you can begin to apply some of those principles of God's Word to your life, or maybe you know somebody who's maybe struggling with the same things that Ben was struggling with in his life, I would encourage you to go to his website. So once again, thank you for joining us here on Point of View, and look forward to the next opportunity.
Thank you so much, and I can't wait for next time, my friend.
Okay. Well, journey mercy for you as you travel. Let's, if we can, just mention that tomorrow we will once again get back into a couple of issues in the news. Doug Paul will be with us. We're going to talk about kingdom innovation for a brave new world, so that will be interesting. And Danny Yohanan will be talking about fighting global poverty, and we'll get into all sorts of other issues in the news and a couple of other topics that desperately need to be addressed. So I certainly would encourage you to go to our website, pointofview.net. As you go there, you're going to find, first of all, a couple of the articles I mentioned earlier, those on why Democrats nearly lost the House, defund the police, and the impact on the election, kind of a counterpoint to the one on did Joe Biden actually do better in these 4 cities. It's one of the statistical issues that people have been raising about the election. And, of course, 2 very good pieces about George Barna's work. And so all of it available at the website, pointofview.net. And, of course, we have a link to Ben Courson's website as well. Hope you learned something today. I'm sure you did. And I'm looking forward to the time tomorrow. I want to thank Andrew and Steve. We'll see you back here tomorrow on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.